Evelyn Harper slammed the ledger down on Charles Whitmore's desk so hard the ink bottle tipped sideways, and she didn't reach to catch it. "These numbers are lies," she said. Her voice didn't shake. "Every single page." Charles didn't flinch. He leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and smiled the slow, deliberate smile of a man who had never once been held accountable for anything. "You've been here 3 weeks, Miss Harper," he said. "I'd be careful about the words you choose." She didn't look away. She should have, but she never could. If you've ever had to fight twice as hard just to be believed, this story is for you. Subscribe to this channel, follow along until the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. Evelyn Harper had not cried at her husband's funeral. She had stood straight beside the grave while the pastor spoke, while the neighbors whispered, while the banker who had driven Thomas into the ground with compounding interest and fraudulent paperwork stood 3 rows back and had the nerve to bow his head like he was grieving alongside her. She had watched that man from across the cemetery and made herself a promise so quiet it never reached her lips. She was done being the kind of woman who waited for someone else to fix things. Thomas had been a good man, gentle and hardworking and honest in a way that Montana Territory did not reward. He'd borrowed money to expand their cattle operation the same year drought hit the flatlands, and when the bank called in the debt early 6 months before the contract permitted, there was nothing Evelyn could do but watch. She'd gone to the county clerk. She'd written letters. She'd sat in the lawyer's office in Billings for 3 hours while a man 12 years younger than her explained very slowly, as though she might not understand, that the terms of the loan were complicated and that she might want to let her husband handle it. Thomas was already in the ground by then. She hadn't told the lawyer that. She'd thanked him for his time, walked out into the August heat, and never went back. The farm sold for 1/3 of what it was worth. She kept the ledger books, every account Thomas had ever kept, every debt, every payment, every entry in his careful handwriting. She kept them because numbers didn't lie. People lied. Numbers, when you read them, honestly told you exactly what had happened and exactly who had done it. She'd found work as an account clerk in Billings for 2 years after that. Then the office closed. Then she took in bookkeeping for 3 different merchants, and one of them paid her, and one of them shorted her twice and blamed her arithmetic, and one of them simply stopped answering the door. She was 29 years old, which was not old, and she knew that, but Montana Territory had a way of wearing a person into something older than their years. By the time she saw the notice posted outside the general store, Red Willow Ranch seeking experienced accountant, wages negotiable, room and board. Included, she had $14 to her name and a suitcase that had belonged to her mother. She took the job before she finished reading the notice. The wagon ride to Red Willow Ranch took most of a morning. The driver was a lean, sun-creased man named Holt, who didn't talk much, which suited Evelyn fine. She watched the land change as they moved away from town, the flatlands opening up into rolling hills with good grass, the kind of grass that meant water somewhere below. Thomas would have noticed that. He always noticed grass. She noticed the fences. They were well kept for a working ranch. That meant somebody cared, or somebody was afraid to let things fall apart. In her experience, those were 2 different kinds of place, and they operated very differently. Holt pulled the wagon up in front of the main house and called out without getting down from the seat. "Brought the accountant." A man came off the porch fast, the way men came off porches when they'd been waiting and wanted you to know it. He was big, not tall exactly, but wide through the chest, and dressed expensively for a ranch, setting a silver watch chain catching the light when he moved. He had the kind of face that was handsome in a studied way, like a man who had always known he was being looked at and had learned to use it. "Miss Harper." He extended his hand and his smile at the same time. "Charles Whitmore, ranch manager. We spoke by letter." "We did," Evelyn said. She shook his hand once, businesslike, and climbed down from the wagon without waiting to be helped. She saw something shift in his expression, just a flicker gone almost immediately. He wasn't used to women who didn't wait. "I'll show you the office," he said. The previous accountant left things in some disorder, I'm afraid. You'll have your work cut out for you." "That's what you're paying me for," Evelyn said. The office was off the main house, a separate room that smelled of old paper and dust and something sour she couldn't name. The desk was stacked. The filing was not a system she recognized. There were 3 different ledger books open to 3 different pages, none of which appeared to connect to each other. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at it. "How long since the last accountant left?" she asked. 8 months, Charles said behind her. 8 months. She looked at the stacks again. "I'll need a week just to establish what I'm looking at." "Of course," Charles said smoothly. "Take whatever time you need. I simply ask that any questions about ranch operations come through me first. Some of our workers are not well. They're ranch hands, Miss Harper, not business people. I wouldn't want anyone to give you incorrect information and muddy the waters." Evelyn turned and looked at him. He was smiling again. That same wide, confident smile, the one that meant he thought he'd just said something very reasonable. "I'll come to you with any questions," she said. She didn't say she'd only come to him. He seemed to take that as agreement and left her to start sorting paper. She worked through the afternoon and past supper. Holt brought her a plate without being asked, knocked twice on the doorframe, set it down on the corner of the desk, and left. She ate without looking up. By the time the light had gone entirely, she had identified 4 separate accounting systems that appeared to have no relationship to one another. 2 sets of payroll records that did not match, and a running tally of supply expenditures that would have outfitted 3 ranches this size. She closed the last ledger book, folded her hands on top of it, and sat quietly for a moment. She had seen bad bookkeeping before. She had seen lazy bookkeeping and careless bookkeeping, and the kind of bookkeeping that happened when someone died mid-project and nobody else knew what they were doing. This was not any of those things. She picked up her pen and started making notes. She was back at the desk by 6 the next morning. She did not go looking for the cowboy. He found her. She was walking the fence line at the north end of the property before breakfast. She always walked a property when she first started work somewhere, because you understood numbers better when you understood what the numbers were supposed to represent. And she came around a stand of cottonwoods and almost walked directly into a man crouching over a snapped fence post. He looked up without startling. He was around 40, maybe a shade under. Sun-darkened and lean, with the kind of hands that came from years of actual work rather than years of directing other people to do it. He wore a plain canvas work shirt and boots that had been resoled at least twice. His hat was pushed back on his head in the way of someone who'd forgotten it was there. He had a measuring look about him. Not unfriendly, not threatening, simply watchful. The kind of eyes that had spent a long time in open country and knew how to be still. "Morning," he said. "Morning," Evelyn said. She stepped around him to get a better look at the break. The post had gone soft from the inside rot that had worked its way up from the ground invisible until it snapped. "You'll need to dig that out about 2 feet deeper than it looks." He glanced at the post, then back at her. "I was figuring 3, he said. 3 is better, she said. There's still moisture in the ground from the spring runoff. It'll come back for you if you don't get below it." He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Not the look Charles gave her, the one that was constantly calculating. This was something different. Something more like genuine curiosity. "You're the new accountant," he said. "Evelyn Harper," she said. "And you're Will," he said. He didn't offer more than that, and she didn't push. "How many posts on this line are you replacing?" she asked. 4 I've found. Probably 2 more I haven't gotten to yet." Evelyn nodded. She was thinking about the supply ledger, the one that showed timber expenditures so far beyond what a working ranch of this size should require that she'd flagged it twice already. "Is all the fencing on the property maintained by the ranch?" she asked. "Or does it run along shared boundary lines with neighboring properties?" Will set down his hammer. He looked at her with that same measured attention. "Most of it's ours," he said. "There's a shared line with the Alderman property on the eastern edge, about a 1/4 mile. Is there a written agreement for maintenance on that section?" There was, 3 years back. "Is it current?" He was quiet for a moment. "I don't believe it's been renewed." Evelyn wrote something in the small notebook she carried. "I'll need to find it, or find why it's not there." Will watched her write. "Charles handles the agreements," he said carefully. "Yes," Evelyn said. "He does." She put the notebook away and walked on. She felt his eyes on her back for a moment, before she heard him pick up the hammer again. She came back past the same fence line 2 hours later, on her way to breakfast. He dug the rotted post out clean, and was setting the new one, packing the dirt in layers the way you did when you wanted it to last. He didn't look up this time, but when she passed, he said without pausing his work, "The agreement you're looking for. If you can't find it in the office files, try the third drawer on the left side of the storage cabinet in the equipment shed. There's a box of older documents nobody's touched in a while." Evelyn stopped walking, turned. "Why would it be there?" she asked. "Because that's where older documents go when someone doesn't want them found easily," he said. He pressed a final layer of dirt down around the post. "But doesn't want to be accused of destroying them either." She looked at him for a long moment. He didn't look up. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. She found the agreement in exactly the place he'd described. She also found 11 other documents she hadn't been looking for. There was a deed transfer for a 40-acre parcel on the ranch's western boundary, dated 2 years prior. The parcel had been sold for a price significantly below market value. The signature on behalf of the ranch was not one she recognized from any other document she'd handled, and the name of the buyer was a company she couldn't locate in any of the county records Charles had provided her. She put everything back where she'd found it, closed the drawer, stood in the equipment shed for a full minute. Then she went back to the office and started mapping what she knew. It took her 4 days to build a complete picture of what Charles Whitmore had been doing. She worked at night after supper when the main house was quiet. She went through every ledger book, every invoice, every payroll record. She cross-referenced supply expenditures against actual supply deliveries, checking them against the informal logs the ranch hands kept. Because ranch hands always kept their own tallies, she'd learned, whether management knew it or not, because their livelihood depended on having their own record of what came and went. The pattern was elegant in its way. That was the thing about sophisticated theft. Whoever built the system had been careful and patient. No single transaction was large enough to draw immediate attention. The fake invoices were written for services that might plausibly have occurred. The payroll discrepancies were small enough that any individual worker might have doubted their own memory before they doubted the record. But compounded over 5 years, the numbers told a devastating story. Charles Whitmore had taken a significant amount of money from Red Willow Ranch. She had an exact figure in her notebook, but she wasn't ready to write it anywhere else yet. He'd also transferred land. That was the part that made her sit very still when she fully understood it. The 40 acres on the western boundary were not the only parcel that had changed hands quietly. There were 3 separate transfers, each to a different company name. Each company impossible to trace through county records. All the paperwork had the same feel, the same careful forgery, the same gaps where documentation should have existed. Someone was selling this ranch piece by piece. She was sitting with this understanding very still on the 4th evening when she heard a quiet knock on the doorframe and looked up to find Will standing there with 2 cups of coffee. "Holt said you haven't come to supper in 3 nights, he said. He set one of the cups on the edge of the desk, well away from her papers. "He's worried you'll collapse and he'll have to carry you." Holt said that. "No," Will admitted. Holt said nothing. "I'm inferring." Despite everything, she was holding all the weight of what she'd found, all the fear she was keeping carefully boxed up so she could keep working. Evelyn almost smiled. "Thank you for the coffee," she said. He didn't leave. He sat on the windowsill with his own cup and looked at the stacked papers without prying. "You've found something," he said, "not a question." She looked at him. "You're observant. It's a habit. A useful one." He drank his coffee. "Are you going to tell me what you've found?" She studied him for a moment. This man she'd spoken to a handful of times who fixed fences and appeared at doorframes with coffee, and directed her toward hidden documents without explaining how he knew they were there. She had assessed a great many people in the last 2 years by necessity. She had learned to read the space between what people said and what they meant. This man said very little, but everything he said was exactly what he meant. "I'm not sure I should," she said carefully. "I don't know enough yet." He nodded, like that was a reasonable answer. "When you do know enough," he said, "will you tell me then? Why do you want to know?" He was quiet for a moment. He turned the coffee cup slowly in his hands. "Because this place matters to me," he said. "More than you might expect for a man in my position." She watched him. "What position is that?" she asked. He smiled very slightly. It changed his face, made it younger, or maybe just more honest. "Ranch hand," he said. "The kind that doesn't know when to stop working." He took his coffee and went. She sat for a long time after he left. She had been afraid for 4 days. A tight, managed fear, the kind that didn't stop you from working, but lived right behind your sternum and reminded you every few hours of what she was risking. She'd had this fear before. She knew its shape. It was the fear of doing the right thing in a world that didn't reliably reward people for it. What was new was the way it had shifted just slightly when he was in the room. She wasn't less afraid, but she was less alone in it. She went back to her numbers. She had what she needed by the end of that week. She had not yet decided what to do with it. Charles came to the office on Friday morning, as he did most Fridays, to review the week's work. He was dressed well, as always, and easy in his manner, and he stood across the desk from her and asked the standard questions, and she answered them with the standard answers, and all the while she was watching him, the way she'd watched the banker at Thomas's funeral, with a cold, clear understanding of exactly what she was looking at. "How are you finding the older records?" he asked, casually. "Complicated," she said. "But I'm getting there. If you have trouble with anything, just let me know. Some of the filing from a few years back can be a bit inconsistent." "I'm sure," she said. He smiled at her. That wide, comfortable smile. "You're doing excellent work, Miss Harper," he said. "Really. It's a relief to have someone competent in this position. The last accountant was well." He spread his hands. "Let's just say he wasn't suited for the demands of a property this size." "What happened to him?" she asked. Charles paused, just briefly. "He moved on," he said. "Better opportunities elsewhere." "Of course," she said. After he left, she sat for a moment. Then she got up, went to the equipment shed, and stood in front of the storage cabinet. She was thinking about what happened to people who found out too much. She was also thinking about a man with Resoled boots who had somehow known exactly where the documents were hidden. She went and found Will at the creek that evening. He was there. She'd noticed he came here most evenings after the day's work was done, sitting on the bank with his hat off and his boots in the dirt. It seemed to be the place he went to be quiet. She sat down beside him without asking. He didn't seem surprised. For a while, neither of them spoke. The creek ran low in the summer heat, but it still moved. There was something steadying about that. "I need to tell you something," she said finally. "All right," he said. "I've found evidence of systematic financial fraud on this ranch," she said. She kept her voice level. "Wage theft, fraudulent invoices, false land transfers. I have records that document it going back approximately 5 years." She paused. "The person responsible is Charles Whitmore." Will didn't move. He didn't look surprised. But she noticed the stillness that came over him, the particular quality of a person receiving confirmation of something they had already suspected, something they had perhaps been waiting a long time to have confirmed. "How certain are you?" he asked. "I checked everything 3 times, she said. "I cross-referenced every document I could find. I matched expenditures to deliveries, payroll records to workers' own tallies. The pattern is too consistent to be error or coincidence." She looked at him. "Someone has been robbing this ranch for years. And it isn't a small amount." Will was quiet for a long moment. The creek moved. A bird called somewhere in the cottonwoods. "The land transfers," he said. "Did you determine where they went? Who holds them now?" I couldn't find the companies in county records, but the paperwork shares common features. I think they're fictitious entities, which means the land didn't actually transfer legally, or if it did, the documentation was forged. Both, he said quietly. Some of each. She turned and looked at him. He was looking at the water. You know more about this than you've said, she said. He turned then and looked at her directly. Those watchful eyes holding something she couldn't quite read, regret maybe, or the particular weight of a person who has carried a truth too long. Yes, he said. Why haven't you done anything? Because knowing something and proving it are different things, he said. And because I had reasons to approach this carefully. He paused. I still do. What reasons? He was quiet for a moment. Not tonight, he said. Tell me what you need to finish this. Tell me what proof is still missing. She wanted to push. She was the kind of woman who pushed. But something in the way he said it, not deflection, not evasion, but the careful honesty of a person choosing the right moment, made her hold back. She told him what she still needed. He listened without interrupting, and when she was done, he nodded slowly. The signed contracts from the supply vendors, he said. The originals. Charles keeps them separately, not in the main office. There's a locked box in his quarters. I can't go into his quarters, she said. No. Will agreed. But I can tell you that Charles rides out every Monday morning to the Delaney property 3 miles west. He's gone for 2 hours at minimum. Has been every Monday for the past 8 months. She looked at him. That's very specific knowledge for a ranch hand, she said. He looked back at her steady and quiet. It is, he said. He didn't explain it. She sat with that. If I do this, she said slowly, and I find what I think I'll find, what then? Who do we bring this to? Charles has relationships with the county clerk, with at least one of the county commissioners. I've seen the correspondence. She stopped herself. She hadn't mentioned the correspondence before. He spent 5 years building protection for himself, Will. I need to know there's somewhere to take this that he hasn't already gotten to. Will looked at her for a long moment, and then he said the thing she hadn't expected. There is, he said quietly. Trust me on that. There is somewhere to take it. You know that for certain. Yes, he said. She held his gaze. All right, she said. Then I'll find the contracts. She started to get up. He spoke again quietly. Evelyn. She stopped. It was the first time he'd used her name. Be careful with Charles, he said. Not because he's intelligent. He isn't particularly. But he's the kind of man who acts badly when he feels cornered. And he's beginning to feel cornered. She turned and looked at him. He's noticed me, she said. Yes. How long has he noticed? Since the second day, Will said. He came to me and asked about you. She felt something cold move through her. He came to you. Why would he come to you? Will picked up his hat from the ground beside him. He turned it in his hands once. Because he thought I might tell him something useful, he said simply. He put the hat back on. I didn't. She studied him. Why did he think you would? He stood, and there was something in the movement, a straightening and easiness, the way a man stood when he was standing on his own ground, that snagged at the edge of her understanding. That, he said quietly, is a conversation for after you find the contracts. He looked at her one more time, that steady, watchful look that she was beginning to know as well as she knew anything about this place. Then he walked back toward the ranch buildings, and Evelyn Harper stood at the edge of the creek with the evening coming down around her and the full weight of what she was carrying pressing against her ribs, and she thought about Thomas, and about the bank, and about the lawyer who had explained things slowly. She thought about all the times the right thing had cost her everything, and nothing had changed. Then she thought about a man who kept documents in the third drawer on the left. A man who knew which mornings Charles rode out and how long he was gone. A man who sat at the creek with his boots off and said, "This place matters to me," in the tone of voice you used when you meant something very different from what the words appeared to say. She thought about the way he'd looked at her when she'd said, "I checked everything 3 times." Then don't stop now. Find the truth completely. Not a man who didn't know what she was walking into. A man who had been waiting for her to be the one who walked into it. She turned and walked back toward the main house, and the evening was dark and warm, and she did not feel like a woman alone. She felt for the first time in a very long time like a woman who had found exactly the right fight. She went back to the office. She picked up her pen. And she kept going. She found the contracts on a Monday morning. Charles rode out at 7, the way Will said he would. Evelyn waited 20 minutes after the sound of his horse had faded completely before she moved. She walked to the main house without hurrying, because hurrying attracted attention, and she had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing a woman in a difficult position could do was look like she was afraid. She wasn't afraid. She told herself that. She told herself that the tight feeling beneath her ribs was simply focus, and she kept walking. Charles kept his private quarters at the back of the main house off the kitchen corridor. The door was unlocked. That surprised her, and then it didn't. Men like Charles rarely locked doors inside their own domain. They relied on the assumption that nobody would dare. She found the box in under 4 minutes. It was a tin lockbox pushed to the back of the lower shelf behind a stack of wool blankets. The lock was simple, the kind that opened with a common key, and Will had left a ring of ranch keys on the corner of her desk that morning, without explanation or comment, the way he always communicated things he couldn't say directly. The third key she tried fit. Inside were 11 contracts. She didn't take them. That was the critical thing she'd decided the night before. She didn't take them because Charles would notice they were gone, and she needed him not to know she'd been here. She had brought paper and a pen in her coat pocket, and she sat on the floor of Charles Whitmore's quarters on a Monday morning in August, and she copied every relevant detail from every contract by hand. Dates, vendor names, amounts, signatures. She was back in her office with the box relocked and the keys returned before Charles's horse appeared at the end of the drive. She sat very quietly at her desk, while her hands shook just slightly for approximately 30 seconds. Then she opened her notebook and started checking her copies against what she already had. Every fake invoice in the ledger books had a corresponding contract in that box. Every single one. And every contract bore the same forged signature, the name of someone who had not worked at Red Willow Ranch in over 4 years. A ranch hand named Denton Cole, who, according to the payroll records Evelyn had found, had been let go in the spring of 1880. Someone had signed Denton Cole's name to 11 fraudulent vendor contracts across a span of 5 years. She didn't know yet whether Denton Cole knew. She didn't know whether he was a willing participant or simply a name on paper. But she knew now that whoever had built this system had been careful enough to put distance between Charles Whitmore and the signatures. She put her pen down and sat with that for a moment. Careful. Patient. The kind of fraud that was designed to survive investigation. Designed by someone who expected eventually to be investigated. She heard footsteps in the corridor and picked up a standard ledger page and was writing figures on it by the time Charles appeared in the doorway. "Productive morning?" he asked. "Very," she said. She didn't look up. "The vendor reconciliation for the second quarter is almost complete." "Excellent." He lingered. She could feel it the way he held himself in the doorframe, taking up space. "Any irregularities worth flagging?" She turned a page. "Nothing I can't resolve." A pause. "Good," he said finally. "That's good to hear." He left. She waited until his footsteps had completely faded before she let herself exhale. She found Will at the equipment shed that afternoon. He was sharpening a blade, long even strokes, not looking up when she came in, but he stopped when she closed the door behind her. She handed him 2 pages of her notes. He looked at them without speaking for a long moment. 11 contracts, he said, all corresponding to fake invoices. All signed with a name that doesn't match any current employee. "Denton Cole," he said quietly. It was not a question. She looked at him sharply. "You know who that is?" "He worked here until 80, Will said. "Good hand. Charles let him go the spring after he started managing. Cole pushed back on some of the supply ordering, said the quantities were too high for what we actually needed. He paused. Charles told the owner the man had been stealing. The word owner hit her in a particular way. She almost asked, but something in the careful flatness of Will's voice stopped her. Was he stealing? No, Will said. He said it simply the way he said everything. He was not. Does Denton Cole know his name is on those contracts? I don't believe so, Will said. I believe Cole is in Wyoming by now, and I believe Charles chose his name specifically because he's gone and can't contradict him. Evelyn took the pages back. She folded them carefully. I need one more thing, she said. The land transfers. I know the paperwork exists. I found 3 of them in the storage cabinet, but I need to verify whether the county land records were actually altered or whether Charles just created internal documentation and hoped nobody would check against the official registry. Will was quiet for a moment. Then, are you asking me to go to the county recorder's office? I'm asking whether you know someone who could. I might, he said. It would take a few days. We may not have a few days, she said. Charles is watching me. Will set down the blade. He turned and looked at her fully. How close is he watching? He came by my office 3 times yesterday, she said. He's never done that before. And one of the other hands, the young one Pete, told me this morning that Charles asked him last week whether I'd been talking to any of the other workers after hours. Will's expression didn't change exactly, but something in it sharpened. When did Pete tell you this? At breakfast. I think Pete thought it was just idle conversation. I don't think he understood why Charles was asking. Pete isn't the problem, Will said. What Pete tells Charles is. He thought for a moment. Don't change anything. Don't rush. If you change your patterns now, Charles will know you've found something. I know that, she said a little sharply. He looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. I know you know that, he said. I'm saying it because I'm... He stopped, looked away briefly. I'm concerned. She registered that. The word, the way he said it. Concerned, she repeated. Yes, he said. About the investigation. He met her eyes. About you, he said. And then, before she could respond to that, I'll get word to the county recorder. There's a man there I trust. He'll check the official registry without making it obvious that he's checking. She held on to that moment a beat longer than was strictly professional. Then she nodded. How long? 3 days. 4 at most. She started for the door. He spoke behind her. Evelyn, the signature you found on those contracts, Denton Cole's name. Can you determine whose handwriting it actually is? She turned. I've been comparing it to every document in the office that has a signature I can attribute. So far I haven't found a match, but I'm still looking. He nodded slowly. Look at the wagon maintenance logs, he said. The handwritten ones from the last 2 years. They're in the second cabinet middle shelf. He paused. Charles doesn't fill those out himself. He has one of the office workers do them. She understood immediately. He had someone write the signatures for him. I believe so, Will said. Someone who does what Charles tells them without asking questions. Who? A man named Gerald Pratt. He's been with Charles since before I... He stopped, started again. Since before Charles took over management. He does administrative work, keeps to himself. Gerald Pratt. She hadn't paid him much attention, a quiet, bespectacled man who worked in a corner of the main house and never spoke unless spoken to. Thank you, she said. She was back in the office within the hour with the wagon logs spread across her desk beside the forged contracts. The handwriting matched in 12 places. She counted. She sat back and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Then she started writing a very organized, very careful summary of everything she had found. The threat came on Wednesday. She was crossing the yard between the main house and the equipment shed when Charles fell into step beside her. He didn't rush to catch up with her, didn't call out. He simply appeared the way he always appeared, smooth and unhurried, like a man who had never in his life had reason to hurry. "How is the reconciliation coming?" he asked pleasantly. "Almost done," she said. She kept walking. "I've been thinking," Charles said, "that once you've finished getting the records in order, we might want to take a different approach to the filing system. I have some ideas about efficiency." "I'm happy to hear them when I've completed the current project," she said. "Of course." He walked beside her for another few paces. "I also wanted to mention, and I say this only out of concern, that some of the other workers have noticed you asking questions about operations, supply chains, that sort of thing." He paused. "I worry that it might create confusion. Ranch hands aren't always the most reliable sources of information about how a business actually runs." She stopped walking. He stopped too and turned to look at her, and there it was again, that smile, comfortable and wide. "I ask questions," she said carefully, "because good accounting requires understanding the actual operations of the business, not just the numbers. Every serious accountant does." "Of course," Charles said. "Of course, I only mean that for questions about operations I should be your first resource. I have the complete picture that the individual workers simply don't have." She looked at him steadily. "You've mentioned that before." "I have," he agreed pleasantly. "I mention it again because it's important." The implication sat in the air between them, clear as a hand on a shoulder. She could feel the weight of it. "I understand," she said. She turned and kept walking. She heard him behind her, not moving, watching her go. She didn't change her pace. But when she got back to the office, she closed the door, something she never did, and stood with her back against it for a moment, and made herself breathe evenly. He knew she was close. He didn't know exactly what she'd found, but he knew she'd found something, and the warning had been very clear. Stop, or there will be consequences. She'd heard warnings like that before. She'd heard them from the bank, from the lawyer, from the county clerk who had explained with great patience why a widow couldn't contest a loan recall without her husband present to sign the documents. She thought about Denton Cole, who had noticed the supply quantities were too high and been accused of stealing for it. She thought about the previous accountant who had moved on. She picked up her pen. She kept going. That evening, Will came to the creek at his usual time, and she was already there when he arrived. He sat beside her, without comment on the fact that she'd come earlier than usual. "I've matched the handwriting," she said without preamble. "Gerald Pratt wrote the signatures on those contracts." Will absorbed this without visible reaction. "Does Pratt know what he was signing?" "I don't know. He may have been told they were routine vendor agreements. He doesn't seem like a man who asks many questions." She paused. "Charles spoke to me today." Will went still. She told him what had been said precisely word for word. She had a good memory for conversation, had always had, because conversations were where the real information lived, the things that never made it into ledger books. When she was done, Will was quiet for a moment. "He's trying to decide," Will said slowly, "whether you're a problem he can manage or a problem he needs to eliminate." The word eliminate hit her in the chest. "That's a strong word," she said. "It's the right word," he said. He turned and looked at her directly. "I'm not trying to frighten you, but I need you to understand what kind of man Charles Whitmore is. He did not build what he's built by leaving loose ends." "The previous accountant," she said. "Left in a hurry," Will said. "In the middle of the night. His family received a letter 2 weeks later saying he'd taken work in Oregon. His wife told me privately she didn't believe it was his handwriting." She sat with that. "And you still couldn't prove anything," she said. "I couldn't prove anything," he said quietly. "I didn't have what you have." She looked at him. The last light was coming down gold and long across the water, and she could see the lines of his face clearly, the particular expression he was wearing. Something that was not quite calm, not quite afraid. Something heavier than both. "What aren't you telling me?" she asked. He turned the hat in his hands. She'd noticed he did that when he was working out how to say something. You asked me once what position I held, he said. You said ranch hand. I said the kind that doesn't know when to stop working, he said. He met her eyes. I wasn't lying, but I wasn't complete. She waited. He set the hat down on his knee. My full name is William Calder Carter, he said. I've been called Will most of my life. He paused. My father built Red Willow Ranch in 1861. He left it to me in 1876. The quiet that followed was absolute. She heard the creek, a night bird somewhere in the trees. You own this ranch, she said. Yes, he said. She thought about 3 weeks of conversations, about the documents in the third drawer, about the way he'd said this place matters to me on the first night, and about how she had heard it as something personal without understanding how entirely literal it was. She thought about Charles Whitmore reporting to a man he thought was a ranch hand. How long? She said finally. Since Charles started managing, he said. 8 months into it, I realized something was wrong. The numbers didn't match what I was seeing on the ground. I started stepping back, working alongside the men, listening. He exhaled slowly. When you own something, people show you what they want you to see. When you're just a man with a hammer, people show you the truth. And Charles, she said, he doesn't know who you are. He's met the owner of Red Willow Ranch, Will said. Twice in town for business meetings. A man named William Carter, who wore city clothes and spoke formally. He's never connected that man to the cowhand who fixes his fences. She absorbed this, all of it. You've been living on your own ranch as a hired hand, she said. For how long? Going on 3 years, he said. She looked at him. That is either the most patient thing I've ever heard, she said slowly, or the loneliest. He didn't answer right away. Both, he said finally. It's been both. She stood up. She needed to move. She walked a few paces along the bank and turned. Why are you telling me now? She asked. Why not from the beginning? Because from the beginning, I didn't know you, he said. He was looking at her steadily, that same watchful, honest attention she'd come to recognize. I needed to know if you were here for the wages or for the truth. I needed to know if you'd keep going when it got difficult. He paused. And I needed to know. He stopped himself. What? She pressed. He was quiet for a moment. I needed to know if what I saw in you from the first day was real, he said quietly, or if I was only seeing it because I'd been out here too long and wanted it to be there. She stood in the last light and looked at this man, this strange patient, quietly extraordinary man who had watched her carry the weight of his own problem for 3 weeks without telling her it was his, and she felt something complicated move through her. Not anger exactly. Not entirely. You should have told me, she said. Yes, he said simply. He didn't argue it. I should have. I've been putting myself at risk, she said, for a ranch I thought was owned by someone who wasn't even present. You were putting yourself at risk for the truth, he said, and for the workers who've had their wages stolen. That's why you kept going, Evelyn. Not because of who owned the land. She stopped. He was right. She hated that he was right a little, and she let herself feel that for a moment. I'm still angry, she said. I know, he said. You're allowed to be. She turned and looked at the water. Does this change what we do next? She asked. No, he said. Except that now you know there's somewhere to take this that Charles hasn't reached, because the person he answers to, he paused, is me. She turned that over. He reports to you, she said slowly, which means when the time comes, you can call a formal meeting. You can summon the lawyers and the county officials without Charles having any warning. Yes, Will said. He'll think it's routine. He's due to present his quarterly management report in 10 days. I've already sent word to my lawyer in Billings. She looked at him. You were planning this. I was hoping, he said. There's a difference. I was hoping someone would come along and build the case I couldn't build myself. He held her gaze. "I didn't expect—" He stopped again. "Didn't expect what?" she said. The creek ran quiet between them. He picked up his hat. "To find myself worried about her safety at 2 a.m, he said. He stood, and the movement had that same settled quality she'd noticed before, a man standing on his own ground. "We have 10 days, Evelyn. Tell me what you still need." She should have let it go. She had work to do, and a man who meant to steal a ranch to bring down, and 10 days was not a long time. But she looked at him standing there in the near dark, and she thought of everything she had been carrying alone since Thomas died: the farm, the lawyers, the $14 and the borrowed suitcase, and the job notice on the wall of the general store. She had been doing the right thing alone for so long she'd almost forgotten it was harder than it needed to be. "The county recorder's verification," she said. "That's the last piece. Once I have that, every element is documented." "You'll have it within the week," he said. "And Charles?" "Let him watch," Will said. "Let him think he's managed you. The best thing you can do right now is let him believe he's still in control." She nodded. "And if he does something before the 10 days are up, if he decides I'm not a problem he can manage?" Will looked at her directly. "Then he'll find out very quickly," he said quietly, "exactly who it is he's been managing for." He walked back toward the main house. She stood at the creek alone. The night had come fully down now, and the stars were coming out one at a time, the way they did out here, slow and enormous, nothing like the sky over Billings, where the light from the town dulled them. She had arrived at Red Willow Ranch 23 days ago, with $14 and a borrowed suitcase, and a promise she'd made to herself over a fresh grave. She'd promised herself she would not be the kind of woman who looked away. She hadn't looked away. And now she was standing on a ranch owned by a quiet man who fixed fences, holding enough evidence to take down a fraud that had run for 5 years, and something else entirely that she wasn't prepared to name. Yet a feeling that had nothing to do with ledger books, and everything to do with a man who had said he lay awake worrying about her safety. She turned and walked back toward her office. She still had work to do. She sat down at the desk and opened the notebook to the next clean page. At the top, she wrote 2 words: 10 days. Then she picked up her pen, and she kept going. The county recorder's letter arrived on a Thursday 7 days before the quarterly meeting. Evelyn was in the office when Holt brought it in, dropped it on the corner of her desk without ceremony, and left. The envelope was plain, no return address the way Will had arranged it. She opened it carefully and read it twice. Then she sat very still for a long moment. The official land registry confirmed 2 of the 3 parcel transfers she'd found in the storage cabinet. 2 parcels, a combined 63 acres on the ranch's western boundary, had been formally recorded as sold. The buyer on both transactions was listed as the Meridian Land and Cattle Company. The sale prices were recorded at roughly 30% of appraised value. The 3rd parcel, 22 acres along the northern creek line, showed no transfer in the official registry at all. The paperwork in Charles's storage cabinet claimed it had been sold 18 months ago. The county records said Red Willow Ranch still owned it. She read that part a 3rd time. Charles had forged a land transfer that hadn't actually happened. He had created internal documentation for a sale that either hadn't gone through yet, or that he intended to complete later, or, and this was the part that made her stomach tighten, a sale where the money had already changed hands, but the county records hadn't been altered because something had gone wrong. She put the letter in the false bottom of the document case she'd brought from Billings. She'd built the false bottom herself 2 weeks ago out of a piece of cardboard and a good eye for measurement. It wasn't sophisticated, but Charles would have to already know it was there to find it. She picked up her pen and updated her summary. She was done with the summary by noon. What she had laid out in order was this 5 years of fraudulent invoices totaling a figure that would make any lawyer's jaw tighten. Systematic payroll theft from 14 identified workers. 2 fraudulent land transfers that had gone through county records, which meant the Meridian Land and Cattle Company, whatever it was, currently held legal claim to 63 acres of Will's ranch. 1 forged internal transfer, with no corresponding county record, suggesting either a transaction in progress or a payment already received for land, Charles didn't yet have the legal mechanism to deliver. 11 vendor contracts, signed with a dead man's name, in the handwriting of Gerald Pratt. And a warning delivered in a corridor from a man who had already made one accountant disappear. She read through it all one final time. Then she carried the case across the yard to the equipment shed where Will was replacing a hinge on the large door, and she handed him the summary without preamble. He read it standing up. She watched his face. He was good at stillness. This man, she'd learned that about him, but there were things he couldn't entirely contain, and as he read the section about the land transfers, something moved through his expression that was old and complicated and had nothing to do with money. "The northern parcel," he said quietly. "There's no county record of the sale," she said. "My father built the first structure on that parcel," Will said. He didn't look up from the page. "The original cabin. It's been empty for years, but I've never—" He stopped. His jaw tightened once. "The money changed hands." "How do you know?" "Because Meridian Land and Cattle sent a surveyor out 14 months ago," he said. "Charles told the ranch hand who was working the north line that week that the surveyor was from the county assessor's office. Routine revaluation." He set the pages down on the work table. "I watched that surveyor work for 2 hours, and I knew he wasn't county. His equipment was too new, and he wasn't taking the kind of measurements a tax assessor takes." "But you couldn't prove it." "I had no paperwork, no names, no transaction records." He turned and looked at her. "Now I do." She took the summary back. 6 days, she said. 6 days, he agreed. She started to leave. He spoke behind her. "Evelyn, the Meridian Land and Cattle Company." His voice had a particular quality, careful, like he was placing each word down gently. "I need to know who owns it." She turned. "I couldn't find it in Montana County records." "Try Wyoming," he said. "Try the Territory Business Registry under a man named Foster Gill." She looked at him. "Who is Foster Gill?" A beat of silence. "Charles Whitmore's brother-in-law," Will said. The air went out of the room. "He's been selling your land," she said slowly, to his own family. "I believe so," Will said. "I've suspected it for over a year. I couldn't prove the connection." He met her eyes. "Can you?" She thought about what she had. The transfer documents, the county records, the forged internal paperwork. A business registry entry, if it existed in Wyoming, linking Foster Gill to Meridian Land and Cattle. If the Wyoming registry confirms it, she said, yes, that changes the nature of the crime significantly. "It changes it from theft to conspiracy," Will said. "And it means Charles hasn't been working alone." She stood with that. "How do I access the Wyoming registry from here?" "My lawyer in Billings has a contact in Cheyenne," Will said. "I'll send word today. If we move fast enough, we'll have confirmation before the meeting." She nodded. She turned to go again. "There's something else," he said. Something in the way he said it stopped her completely. She turned back. He was looking at the work table, not at her. "Charles came to me yesterday morning," he said. "He asked me, the ranch hand Will, whether I'd noticed the new accountant spending time in areas of the property she didn't need to be in for her work." He paused. He was specific. He mentioned the equipment shed. He mentioned the creek. She heard her own heartbeat. "What did you tell him?" she said. "That I hadn't noticed anything unusual," Will said. "That you seemed like a careful woman who liked to understand the whole operation before she put numbers to it." "Did he believe you?" Will finally looked up. "I don't know," he said honestly. "He listened. He thanked me. And then he asked me whether I thought a woman like you, his words, was the kind of person who caused trouble, or the kind who could be reasoned with." A cold clarity moved through her. "What did you say?" she asked. "I said I thought you were the kind of person who did what was right," Will said. "And that in my experience, that was neither of those things he'd described." She looked at him. "He didn't like that answer," she said. "It wasn't a question." "No," Will said. "He didn't." She left the equipment shed and crossed the yard back to the main house and walked straight to her office and closed the door. and she stood there for 30 seconds thinking clearly and fast. Charles was circling. She had 6 days. 6 days until the quarterly meeting, until Will could bring his lawyer in, until everything she had documented could be laid in front of people who had the authority to act on it. 6 days where she needed Charles to believe she was still manageable, still the woman he could warn off with a smile and a corridor conversation. And Charles was asking the ranch hands about her movements. She went back to her desk and picked up the ledger she'd been working from when Charles had interrupted her on Friday, and she spent the next 2 hours doing entirely routine, visible, unalarming work on the second quarter vendor reconciliation. Numbers that didn't implicate anyone. Numbers that looked exactly like what Charles thought she was doing. It was the longest 2 hours she could remember. Pete came to the doorway mid-afternoon with a question about a supply receipt. From the previous month, a genuine question, the kind a ranch hand had when a purchase hadn't been logged right, and she answered it carefully. And as he was leaving, she said conversationally, the way you said things that were meant to travel. "Tell Mr. Whitmore, I'll have the vendor reconciliation completed by Friday. No issues." Pete nodded, unsuspecting, and went. She watched the doorway after he left. No issues. Let Charles hear that. Let him hear it twice. She was composing the next section of her official summary in her head that evening when Gerald Pratt knocked on her door. She had not spoken to Gerald Pratt more than a dozen words in the entire time she'd been at Red Willow Ranch. He was a quiet, closed-off man somewhere in his 40s who moved through the main house like he was trying not to be noticed. She had noticed him. Of course, she noticed everyone, but she'd filed him away under peripheral, not immediately relevant, and moved on. He stood in the doorway now, looking like a man who had been working up to something for several days and had finally run out of time. "Miss Harper," he said. "Mr. Pratt." She kept her voice neutral. "Can I help you?" He came in without being invited and closed the door behind him, and that told her everything she needed to know about his state of mind. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to understand that I didn't know. When I signed those papers, I was told they were vendor renewal agreements. Routine paperwork." His voice was tight. "Charles said the regular signatory was unavailable, and he needed them filed before the end of the month. He told me to sign with the name that was printed above the signature line." She looked at him steadily. She didn't confirm or deny that she knew what he was referring to. She let the silence work. "I should have asked more questions," Gerald said. "I know that. I've known it for 2 years." He swallowed. "I looked at some of the invoices last year. The ones from the vendors whose contracts I'd signed. Some of those vendors don't exist. I looked them up. I couldn't find them." He stopped. His hands were shaking just slightly. "I need you to know I wasn't part of this. Whatever Charles has been doing, I wasn't a willing part of it." Evelyn set down her pen. "Mr. Pratt," she said carefully, "I appreciate you coming to tell me this, but I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me honestly." He nodded. "Did Charles tell you to come here today?" A pause. Not long, but real. "No," Gerald said. "He told me last week to stay away from you. That's partly why I'm here." His jaw worked. "I'm not a brave man, Miss Harper, but I'm not willing to go down with him. If whatever he's built is about to come apart, I want to be on the right side of it before it does." She looked at him for a long moment. A man who wasn't brave, but a man who could read which way the wind was blowing. She'd dealt with enough people like Gerald Pratt to know that his self-interest right now was pointed in the same direction as the truth. "Tell me exactly what Charles told you to sign," she said. "And when." He told her. All of it. 11 contracts over 3 years. Each time the same story, routine paperwork, unavailable, signatory sign. This name, don't ask questions. He'd never been told what the contracts were for. He'd never been given copies. She wrote everything down. "I'm going to need you to sign a statement," she said when he was done. "Everything you've just told me written out and signed with your own name." Gerald looked frightened. "What happens to me?" "If you cooperate fully and your account is accurate," she said, "you're a witness, not a defendant." She paused. "But I can't promise that if you go back to Charles tonight and tell him what you've told me." He understood the shape of that immediately. "He'll know I talked to you," Gerald said. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe you spent an hour in here reviewing a supply reconciliation that needed a second set of eyes. You came in on work business, nothing unusual." Gerald Pratt was not a brave man, but he was not a stupid one. "I'll write the statement tonight," he said. He did. He slid it under her door at 9 o'clock, 4 pages, in careful handwriting, and she read it once, locked it in the document case, and sat quietly for a while. Things were moving faster than she'd planned. She found Will at the creek. He was there in the dark, which meant he'd been watching for her. She told him about Gerald Pratt. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him thinking the particular quality of his silence when he was working through something complex. "Gerald's statement changes the timeline," he said. "I know. If Charles finds out Gerald talked to me, he'll move before the meeting," Will said. "He won't wait 6 days." She'd been thinking that too, the thought sitting cold and heavy in her chest since Gerald had closed the door behind him. "Then we move the meeting," she said. Will looked at her. 3 days, she said. "Can your lawyer be here in 3 days?" 2, Will said quietly. "I can have him here in 2. She stared at him. "You already sent for him." "I sent for him the day Gerald started avoiding me," Will said. 3 days ago. A man who is usually hard to read became very readable when he started flinching every time Charles walked into a room. He paused. "My lawyer should arrive day after tomorrow, Saturday evening." She absorbed this. "What about the Wyoming registry, the Meridian land and cattle connection?" "My lawyer is carrying that information with him," Will said. His contact in Cheyenne confirmed it 4 days ago. Foster Gill is listed as the sole principal of Meridian land and cattle registered in Wyoming Territory in 1879. He held her eyes. 1 year before Charles took over management at Red Willow Ranch. The pieces landed in sequence. "They planned this before Charles was ever hired," she said. "Charles came to me. Came to the owner of record William Carter in his city clothes with excellent references and a smooth manner and numbers that looked right on paper," Will said. "I was 22 months out from my father's death and still learning what I didn't know about running a ranch this size." The words were flat, not self-pitying, just honest. He was very good at making things look right on paper. "Until I looked at the paper," she said. "Until you looked at the paper," he agreed. Something passed between them in the dark. Not sentimental, just true. "I need to tell you something," Will said. He turned the hat in his hands, that habit she'd come to know. "When this is over, when Charles is out and the legal work is done, I'm going to offer every worker on this ranch whose wages were shorted a full accounting and a full repayment. I've already had my lawyer calculate what I can confirm from the payroll records." She hadn't expected that, the speed of it. "That's 14 workers," she said. "Some of them going back 5 years. "Yes," he said simply. She looked at him in the dark. "Most owners," she said, "would pay the minimum required and call it settled." "I know," he said. "Why?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was quiet too, but entirely certain. "Because they worked this land in good faith and someone stole from them," he said. "And because what a man does with what he owns is a measure of him, not just of the land." She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Friday came and Charles was smooth and pleasant at their morning meeting and asked all the right questions and smiled his wide, comfortable smile. And Evelyn answered everything professionally and gave him nothing. And she watched his eyes while she talked and saw what she'd been waiting to see, the faint, persistent calculation of a man who was deciding something. He had decided something. She could see it. Whatever he'd landed on it, and the Friday morning meeting had just confirmed it for him. She went back to her office and sat very still for 30 seconds. Then she got up and found Pete in the yard and told him she needed Holt to drive her to the supplier in town that afternoon to verify a delivery discrepancy. A normal, explainable errand. She actually did go to town. actually did verify the delivery. She was not a woman who created false pretexts unless she had no other option. And while she was in town, she went to the telegraph office and sent a wire to Will's lawyer in Billings. Come tomorrow, not Sunday. Saturday morning, she was back at the ranch by 4. At 6 o'clock, Charles came to her office. He didn't knock this time. He opened the door and came in, and he wasn't smiling. I've been looking over the supply reconciliation, he said. He set a stack of papers on her desk. There are discrepancies I need to discuss with you. She looked at the papers. She recognized them. They were the ledger pages she'd been working from, except that several of the figures had been changed. Not subtly, noticeably. The kind of changes that if someone compared these pages to the originals in her document case would look like she had made errors or alterations. She understood what she was looking at. She understood it completely. These aren't my figures, she said. They're your pages, Charles said. From your ledger. They've been altered, she said. That's a serious accusation, Miss Harper. She looked up from the papers and met his eyes directly. The smile was entirely gone. What she was looking at finally without the comfortable mask was a man who had made a decision. Yes, she said. It is. I think, Charles said slowly, that what we have here is a situation where a new employee still learning the operation has made some significant errors in her record-keeping, and perhaps under the pressure of that realization has become confused about the source of those errors. He was framing it. Right now, standing in her office, he was building the story he intended to use. Accountant makes errors. Accountant panics. Accountant accuses her employer to deflect blame. It was elegant in the same way all his schemes were elegant. Simple, plausible, designed to make her the problem. I see, she said. I think it would be best, Charles continued, his voice entirely reasonable, if we agreed that you would step back from the account work while I review what's been filed, temporarily. For your own protection, you understand. This way, if there are questions about the records, no one can suggest that you continued to handle them after discrepancies were noted. Translation: stop working and stop talking, or I will make you the person who altered those documents. She looked at the papers on her desk. She looked at Charles Whitmore standing across from her, and she thought about Denton Cole and the accountant who'd left in the middle of the night, and Gerald Pratt with his shaking hands, and she thought about Thomas and the bank, and 14 years of watching people with power use it like a weapon against people who were only trying to tell the truth. She stood up. Charles was taller than her. It didn't matter. Mr. Whitmore, she said. Her voice was level, completely level. I appreciate your concern. I'll review the pages you've shown me and have a response for you tomorrow morning. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected either capitulation or argument, and she'd given him neither. I think it would be best if we resolved this tonight, he said. Tomorrow morning, she said. I'm certain by then we'll have a clearer picture of things. He looked at her for a long moment. The calculation was visible, fully visible now, no pretense of pleasantry covering it. All right, he said. He picked up the papers. Tomorrow morning, then. He left. She didn't sit down. She went straight to the document case, took out the complete original summary, took out Gerald Pratt's statement, took out the county recorder's letter and the copies she'd made of every forged contract, and she divided the package into 2 identical sets. One set went back in the document case. The other set she wrapped in oilcloth. She'd bought it in town that afternoon, along with everything else she'd needed, and she walked to the creek in the near dark, and she knelt at the base of the largest cottonwood on the bank, and she dug a hole with the small folding spade she'd also bought in town, and she buried the second package 18 inches down. She marked the spot with 3 flat stones stacked in a line. She stood up and dusted off her hands. Then she turned and walked back toward the main house. Will was sitting on the equipment shed steps when she passed. He'd seen her go out. He'd seen her come back. He didn't ask. She stopped in front of him. He came to my office tonight, she said. He's made his move. Will looked at her steadily. My lawyer arrives tomorrow morning, he said. I need him here by 8, she said. He'll be here by 7, Will said. She nodded. She started to walk past him. He stood up, and she stopped, and they were standing very close together in the dark, and she could feel the weight of everything that was coming the morning. The meeting. The moment when Charles Whitmore would walk into a room expecting to be the most powerful person in it and discover he was wrong. "Are you all right?" Will asked. She thought about that. Really thought about it. "Ask me again tomorrow afternoon," she said. He almost smiled. "I will," he said. She went inside. She didn't sleep. She sat at her desk and she read through her complete summary one more time. Every page, every figure, every cross-reference and notation, and documented discrepancy. And by the time the sky outside started lightening toward gray, she had it so thoroughly in her memory that Charles Whitmore could burn every piece of paper she owned, and she could reconstruct it from nothing. She closed the notebook. She stood up. She smoothed her skirt, straightened her collar, and looked at the closed office door. On the other side of that door was a man who had spent 5 years building something, and a morning that would take it apart, and a quiet cowboy who had been waiting 3 years for exactly this. She opened the door and walked out into the early light. She was ready. Will's lawyer arrived at 6:53 in the morning. Evelyn knew because she heard the wagon before she saw it, and she was already standing at the window of her office when it pulled up. The man who climbed down was short and deliberate in his movements, with a leather document case that he held like it contained something irreplaceable. His name was Marcus Hale, and he had the particular quality of a man who had spent 30 years in rooms where powerful people lied, and had stopped being surprised by it a long time ago. Will met him in the yard. They shook hands briefly, the kind of handshake between men who know each other well enough not to need ceremony. Will said something. Hale nodded, looked toward the main house, nodded again. Then Will looked up toward her window. She moved away from it and went to her desk and picked up the document case. They met in the equipment shed, the three of them, because it was the one place on the ranch where Charles Whitmore never went before 9 in the morning. Will stood near the door. Hale sat on a workbench and opened his own case and set out papers with the efficiency of a man running against a clock. Evelyn laid everything she had in front of him. The summary. Gerald Pratt's statement. The county recorder's letter. The copied contracts. The payroll cross-references. The handwriting comparison. Hale read without speaking. He turned pages without looking up. He spent 4 minutes on Gerald Pratt's statement and 3 minutes on the land transfer section, and then set everything down and looked at her over the top of his glasses. "You did this in 4 weeks, he said. 26 days, she said. Hale looked at Will. She did this in 26 days. I know, Will said. Hale looked back at the papers. The Wyoming confirmation is in my case. Foster Gill incorporated Meridian Land and Cattle in November of 1879. He pulled a document and laid it beside the land transfer copies Evelyn had made. Charles Whitmore was hired as manager of Red Willow Ranch in February of 1880, 3 months later. They set it up in advance, Evelyn said. They set it up in advance, Hale confirmed. He tapped the incorporation document. Which means this isn't opportunistic theft. This is a conspiracy with premeditation. That changes what we can ask for and what we can recover. He looked at Will. The 2 parcels that transferred I can move to void both transactions on the grounds of fraud and forgery. It'll take time and it'll be contested, but the legal basis is solid. How solid? Will asked. Solid enough that Foster Gill will settle rather than go to court, Hale said flatly. Because if he goes to court, a judge will see this. He gestured at Evelyn's documentation, and Gill doesn't want that. Will nodded once. Charles is making his move this morning, Evelyn said. She told Hale about the altered ledger pages about the conversation in her office the night before, about the framework Charles was building to make her the accountant who had made errors and panicked. Hale listened with the focused attention of a man who had heard this particular kind of move before. He's going to come to you this morning, Hale said when she finished, expecting a frightened woman who either backs down or swings wildly and makes herself look unstable. He's done this before, probably with the previous accountant. He straightened his glasses. We don't give him either of those things. What do we give him? Evelyn asked. A room full of people he didn't know would be here, Hale said. He looked at Will. You said you could get the county sheriff and the circuit judge's clerk here by 9. I sent word Thursday night, Will said. They'll be here. Evelyn looked at him. You sent word Thursday night. Before Charles came to your office, Will confirmed. I'd seen enough by Thursday to know we weren't waiting for the quarterly meeting. She absorbed that. This man who moved quietly and ahead of everything, always exactly one step further forward than she expected. We need Charles in that meeting room at 9 o'clock, Hale said. Without warning. Without time to prepare. He looked at Evelyn. Can you get him there? She thought about it. Tell him you've reviewed the pages he brought you, and you have a response, Will said quietly. He'll come. She looked at him. He wants to see whether he's scared you or not, Will said. He'll come to find out. She picked up the document case. I'll tell him 8:30, she said. Give us time to set up. She crossed the yard to the main house. She knocked on Charles's door precisely, and without hesitation, and when he opened it, she looked at him with the expression of a woman who had been awake all night, worrying because she had been awake all night, and she let that show just enough. I've reviewed the pages, she said. I think we need to talk. 8:30 in the main meeting room. I'd like to go through the figures together so we can identify where the confusion started. Charles looked at her, that calculation running behind his eyes. 8:30, he said, satisfied. The word of a man who thought he was walking into a conclusion. 8:30, she said. She turned and walked away. She did not look back. At 8:25, Evelyn was seated at the long table in the main meeting room with the document case in front of her and Marcus Hale to her left. Sheriff Donovan Cole, no relation to Denton, she'd confirmed, sat at the far end of the table with a deputy beside him, both of them having arrived at 8 and been briefed by Hale in under 15 minutes. The circuit judge's clerk, a young man named Arthur Beam, who took notes the way other men breathed, sat beside the sheriff with 2 blank ledger pages and 3 sharpened pencils. Gerald Pratt was in a chair against the wall. He was very pale. He was there because Hale had asked for every witness and because Gerald Pratt had slid 4 pages under a door at 9 o'clock and made his choice the night before. Will stood near the window. He had changed, not dramatically, not beyond his means, but deliberately. He wore a clean shirt, and his good boots the ones Evelyn had not yet seen, and he held himself in the particular way he held himself when he wasn't trying to disappear into the background, like a man on his own ground, which he was. At 8:30 exactly, Charles Whitmore opened the door. He saw the room and stopped. Not long enough that a man watching casually would have noticed. Just a fraction of a second where his body understood something before his mind had fully caught up. Then the mask was back in place, smooth and professional, and he came in and looked at Hale with polished composure. I don't believe we've met, he said. Marcus Hale, Hale said. Attorney, representing the interests of Red Willow Ranch. Charles's eyes moved to the sheriff. Back to Hale. Something adjusted in his posture, a subtle tightening, like a man checking which exits were available. I wasn't informed there would be a legal meeting this morning, he said. His voice was still even. Evelyn had to credit him for that. No, Hale agreed pleasantly. You weren't. Charles's eyes found Evelyn. She looked back at him steadily and said nothing. Then Charles looked at Will, and something happened to his face. It was subtle, the kind of thing you missed if you weren't watching carefully. But Evelyn had been watching carefully for 26 days, and she did not miss it. Recognition. And beneath recognition, the beginning of something that Charles Whitmore had probably not felt in a very long time. Fear. Will, Charles said carefully. Morning, Charles, Will said. His voice was entirely conversational, the same voice he used every day, the same quiet ease. He didn't change anything about himself, and somehow that was the most devastating thing in the room. I didn't realize you'd be... Charles stopped, started again. What is this? Please sit down, Hale said. We have quite a bit to cover. Charles did not sit down immediately. He stood for a moment in the middle of the room, and Evelyn watched him calculate. Watched him run through his options and assess each one and come up against the same answer every time. The room was full. The exits were covered by the presence of a sheriff. The woman he had meant to discredit was sitting across the table with a document case in front of her and an expression like bedrock. He sat down. Mr. Whitmore. Hale said, My name is Marcus Hale, and I represent the owner of Red Willow Ranch, William Calder Carter. He gestured toward Will without theatrics. Who, as you may have gathered, has been present on this property for the past 3 years, in a capacity that did not fully represent his position. Charles looked at Will. Will looked back. You, Charles said. One word, very flat. Me, Will said. A silence stretched across the room. Charles recovered faster than Evelyn expected. She watched him find something under the shock, not composure exactly, but a substitute for it. His hands came together on the table in front of him. Whatever you think you have, Charles said, and his voice was almost steady. I want to remind everyone in this room that I have operated this ranch in full accordance with the management agreement I signed with the owner. Any financial decisions were made with appropriate authority. Let's talk about those financial decisions, Hale said. He nodded to Evelyn. She opened the document case. She did not rush. She had 37 days of work in front of her, and she had been over it so many times she could recite it in her sleep, and she laid it out the way she had laid out everything in her life that mattered, methodically, completely, without a single word more than was needed. The fraudulent invoices, the payroll discrepancies, the forged signatures, Gerald Pratt's statement, the land transfer documents and the county recorder's confirmation, the Wyoming Business Registry entry for Meridian Land and Cattle, and the name Foster Gill on the line that said principal owner. She laid each piece down and explained it, and Arthur Beam's pencil moved without stopping, and the sheriff's expression got progressively quieter in the way of a man who was moving from skepticism to certainty, and Gerald Pratt sat against the wall with his hands folded and his eyes on the table. Charles interrupted 3 times. The first time to challenge the payroll records, claiming the discrepancies were the result of performance deductions he had full authority to apply. Evelyn set the relevant section of the management agreement in front of him and asked him to find the clause permitting unilateral wage deductions without worker notification. He read it. He set it down. The second time he interrupted to say the vendor contracts had all been reviewed and approved by ranch management. Evelyn set Gerald Pratt's statement in front of him and watched Charles look at Gerald and watched Gerald look at the table and didn't say anything because she didn't need to. The third time he interrupted, he looked directly at her and said, You altered those figures yourself. The ledger pages I brought to your office last night. You changed them to make it look like... Mr. Whitmore? Hale's voice cut through cleanly. The pages you brought to Miss Harper's office last night. Where are they now? I have them, Charles said. May I see them? A beat. I don't have them with me at this moment, Charles said. Then I'll note for the record, Hale said, that the original ledger books, all 8 of them, have been in the custody of Miss Harper's locked document case since the 3rd day of her employment, and that upon examination this morning, Sheriff Donovan confirmed the seals she placed on the case locks are intact. He looked at the sheriff. Intact, the sheriff confirmed. Charles said nothing. The pages you brought to Miss Harper's office, Hale continued, were copies, made from the originals in her case, with figures altered after the copying was done. He paused. Which we can demonstrate through a direct comparison to the originals if you'd like to proceed in that direction. Charles did not want to proceed in that direction. The silence this time was longer. Evelyn watched it happen. She had imagined this moment, not exactly this, not with this particular room and these particular people, but the moment itself, the moment when the architecture of a deception met the architecture of the truth, and one of them had to give way. She had imagined it might feel like something large and dramatic. Instead, it felt very quiet, like a held breath releasing. "Foster Gill is my wife's brother," Charles said finally. His voice had changed. The smoothness was gone. What was underneath it was flatter and tired, and something almost like defiance drained of conviction. "The land transactions were investments. I had discretionary authority over—" "You had discretionary authority over ranch operating expenses under $10,000, Hale said. "The management agreement is explicit on that point. Land transactions required direct authorization from the owner." He set the agreement on the table, "which you never sought, because the owner didn't know they were happening." "Carter," Charles began. "Mr. Carter," Hale said simply, not unkindly, just correcting the form of address the same way you'd correct any misstatement of fact. Charles looked at Will. Will had not moved from his position near the window. He had not spoken since his initial acknowledgement that he was who he was. He stood there with his hands at his sides and watched Charles Whitmore sit across a table from the evidence of 5 years of theft and the particular quiet steadiness of a man who had waited a very long time for this morning. "I built this operation," Charles said, "and now there was something in it that was almost real, not remorse, not quite, but the genuine bewilderment of a man who had convinced himself over years that his contributions justified what he'd taken. When I came here, this place was half what it is now. The cattle numbers, the supplier relationships, the reputation in the territory I built that." "You did some of that," Will said. It was the first time he'd spoken since Charles had sat down, and the room changed slightly when he did. "I know what you built. I was here." He paused. "You also took $83,000 over 5 years, shorted 14 men who worked this land, and sold 63 acres of my father's ranch to your brother-in-law for a price you two agreed on over a supper table." Another pause, and this one was the kind that settled into the room like weight. "Don't tell me what you built." Charles looked at him. For a moment, just a moment, the calculation was entirely gone. What was there instead was the face of a man hearing the full measure of what he'd done said plainly out loud, and finding it larger than he'd let himself understand. Then the calculation came back. "I want to speak with my own lawyer," he said. "That is absolutely your right," Hale said. He was already writing. "In the meantime, Sheriff Cole has some things to discuss with you." The sheriff stood. Charles looked around the room one more time. At the sheriff, at Hale, at Gerald Pratt, who still hadn't looked up, at Evelyn, who was watching him with the clear, steady attention she'd carried into every room for 26 days. Then at Will. One last time at Will. And if Evelyn had to name what was in Charles Whitmore's face in that moment, she would have said disbelief. Not at being caught by this particular person in this particular way, by the man he had spoken to every week for 3 years without ever understanding who he was talking to. The sheriff moved to the door. Charles stood. "Miss Harper," he said. He looked at her, and he didn't use his smile. He was beyond that now. "You have to know this wasn't personal." She looked at him. 14 men, she said. "By name. I can give you all 14 names. The wages they were shorted to the dollar for every month over 5 years." She set her notebook on the table. To them, it was personal. He left the room between the sheriff and the deputy, and the door closed behind them, and the room was quiet. Gerald Pratt made a sound just once, not quite a word, not quite anything. The sound of a man putting down something he'd been carrying for too long. Then he was quiet. Hale was writing. Arthur Beam was writing. The scratch of pencils on paper was the only thing in the room for a moment. Will moved away from the window. He came to stand beside the table near her, and he didn't say anything immediately, and neither did she. "The northern parcel," she said finally. "The one where the internal transfer was forged, but the county records weren't changed." "Still mine," Will said. "And the 2 that did transfer." "Hale will file to void them by end of week," Will said. "Foster Gill will fight it for about 4 minutes when he sees what we have." He glanced at Hale, who nodded without looking up from his writing. 4 minutes, she said. "Generous estimate," Hale said, "despite everything. The long night, the no sleep, the weight of the last 26 days, Still sitting solidly across her shoulders, Evelyn felt something loosen in her chest. She closed the document case. She sat for a moment. Will sat down across from her. The table was still covered with papers, with evidence, with the careful architecture of everything she'd built. He looked at it all, and then he looked at her. "I owe you something," he said. "You owe me my wages," she said, "which you've been paying." "More than that," he said. He held her eyes. "I put you in the path of a dangerous man without fully preparing you for how dangerous he was. I knew what Charles was capable of, and I let you carry more of this than was fair because—" He stopped. "Because you needed it to come from me," she said. "Someone he hadn't already managed." "Yes," he said. "And because I couldn't build what you built. I didn't have the training. I didn't have the eye for the numbers." He paused. "And because I trusted you before I had a right to trust you, and I am aware that's not entirely a reasonable thing to have done." She looked at him across the table covered in papers in the room where Charles Whitmore had sat an hour ago, and understood his life was about to change permanently. She looked at this man who had spent 3 years on his own land, pretending to be invisible, waiting for someone who would see clearly enough, and be stubborn enough, and refuse consistently enough to look away. "It was reasonable," she said. "You had good instincts." "I had good instincts about you," he said. And the way he said it made it into something different from what the words appeared to be, something quieter and more specific. She was not a woman who blushed, but she felt something warm move through her that she did not try to explain away. "The workers," she said. "The 14. I'll speak to each of them today," he said. "Personally, every man. Some of them have been here for years," she said. "They're going to have a lot of questions about who's been running this ranch." "I know." He picked up his hat, turned it once. "I reckon they deserve honest answers." "They do," she agreed. He set the hat down again. "There's something else I need to say," he said. "And I'm going to say it plainly, because I have spent 3 years not saying things plainly, and I'm done with that." She waited. "I told you I was concerned about you," he said. "A few days ago, at the creek." "You did?" she said. "I was imprecise," he said. "Concerned it isn't the right word. It's the word I used because the right word was more than I had standing to use yet." He looked at her steadily. "What I am, Evelyn, is considerably more invested in your well-being than a ranch owner has any practical reason to be in his accountant's." The room was quiet. Outside somewhere she could hear the sounds of the ranch going on boots on hard ground, the distant movement of horses, the ordinary life of a working place that had just gotten its footing back under it. She looked at William Calder Carter across the table. She thought about the first morning, the fence post and the rotted wood, and a man who had said 3 feet before she could tell him. She thought about the coffee appearing on the corner of her desk without ceremony. She thought about the creek and the dark, and his voice saying, "This place matters to me," and all the weeks she'd heard that as something smaller than it was. She thought about Thomas, about the farm, about the $14 and the borrowed suitcase, and the promise she'd made herself at the graveside. She thought about what it meant to find yourself somewhere you hadn't expected, carrying something heavier than you'd planned, and discovering that the person working beside you had been waiting for exactly you. "I know what you are," she said. He looked at her. "I've known for a while," she said. "I didn't have the right word either. I was waiting to be sure." "Are you sure?" he asked. She picked up her notebook and her pen. She looked at him. "Ask me again at the creek tonight," she said, "when there isn't a lawyer in the room." Will looked at Marcus Hale. Hale was writing, and had the expression of a man who had heard nothing at all. Will looked back at Evelyn. For the first time since she had known him in all the weeks of quiet mornings and careful words and dark evenings at the water's edge, she saw him smile. Not the faint, cautious thing she'd seen before. A real smile, full and unguarded and entirely human. It changed his face completely, made it younger and open and honest in a way that the stillness never quite was. "I'll be there," he said. She stood and picked up the document case and walked to the door. She stopped in the doorway and turned back. "Will?" she said. He looked at her. "You owe Denton Cole an apology," she said, "and a letter, wherever he is in Wyoming." He nodded slowly. "I'll write it today," he said. She looked at him one more moment, that open, unguarded face. The smile that was already softening back into his usual stillness, but different now, the stillness of a man who had set something down. She turned and walked out into the morning. The ranch was alive around her. Holt was crossing the yard with a purpose. Two hands she knew by name, Calloway and Pete, were working near the barn, and when she passed, Pete looked up and said, "Morning, Miss Harper," the way he always did, and she said, "Morning, Pete," the way she always did, and everything was ordinary and nothing at all was the same. She went to her office. She opened the document case. She took out one fresh page, and at the top, she wrote in her clear, precise handwriting, "Workers' wage reconciliation begin today. 14 names." She wrote them all from memory because she had put them there deliberately weeks ago and they had not moved. She picked up her pen. She started at the top of the list. She had work to do. The wage reconciliation took 11 days. Evelyn had expected it to take longer. She'd built the timeline assuming pushback, assuming missing records, assuming the kind of passive resistance that happened when an organization had spent years running one way and was being asked to run another. What she had not built in was Will. He sat with her in the office on the first morning, not hovering, not directing, just present, and when she laid out the 14 worker files and explained the documentation gap that existed for each one, he listened, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He went and got Holt, who had been at Red Willow Ranch for 19 years. Holt, who had driven her from the wagon depot on her first morning and set plates outside her door without being asked. Holt, who said almost nothing and apparently remembered everything. Will brought him into the office and said, "Holt, Evelyn needs to know what the actual work assignments were for every man on payroll going back 5 years. Calloway, Pete, all of them. Can you help her with that?" Holt looked at the 14 files. He looked at Evelyn. "I can tell you what every man on this ranch did every day for the last 7 years," Holt said. "I've been keeping my own log." Evelyn looked at him. "Why?" she asked. "Because somebody had to," Holt said simply. He went and got the log. It was a battered composition book, dense with his small handwriting, every day, accounted for every man named, every task recorded. 7 years of it. Evelyn held it for a moment. "Holt," she said carefully, "did you know what was happening with the payroll?" Holt was quiet for a beat. "I knew the numbers weren't right," he said. "I couldn't prove it. I kept figuring if I kept the log long enough, somebody with the right kind of mind would come along and be able to use it." She looked at Will. Will looked at Holt, with an expression that was something between gratitude and the particular pain of a man understanding how long other people had been quietly carrying his problem with him. "Thank you," Will said. Holt shrugged once the way a man did when he'd done something that mattered and didn't need it acknowledged. "Pay the men what they're owed," he said. "That's thanks enough." With Holt's log, the reconciliation moved fast. By the 3rd day, she had verified figures for 11 of the 14 workers. By the 6th day, all 14. By the 11th day, she had a complete accounting document signed and witnessed by Marcus Hale, who had stayed on at the ranch specifically for this purpose, with a payment total that she handed to Will on a single clean page. He looked at it. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch at the number. He signed the authorization. "When can they be paid?" he asked. "I can have the bank drafts prepared by Friday," she said. "Do it Thursday," he said. She did it Thursday. She was there when Will spoke to the men. He gathered them after the morning work, all 14 of them, plus most of the rest of the ranch, because word had gotten around the way it always did on a working ranch, where people lived close together, and information traveled on its own. They stood in the yard, this collection of weathered, careful men who had spent years on land they respected for a manager they had tolerated, and an owner they had never seen. Will stood in front of them without ceremony. No prepared speech, no lawyer beside him, no paper in his hand. "Most of you know by now who I am," he said. and most of you know what was taken from you. I'm here to tell you that I know it too. I know the amount. I know the years. And I know that knowing don't fix what it felt like to see a number on your pay packet that wasn't what you earned. The yard was completely quiet. I'm not going to stand here and tell you I didn't know what was happening, Will said. Because the truth is, I suspected. I suspected, and I spent too long trying to prove it the careful way, and while I was being careful, men who worked this land honestly were being shorted. He paused. That's on me. I own that. Nobody spoke. Calloway, who was the longest-serving hand after Holt, and who had the kind of face that had spent years learning not to show what it felt, said, "You're paying it back." "All of it," Will said. "To the dollar." Calloway was quiet for a moment. "Then we're square," he said. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It wasn't the wiping clean of something that had happened. It was the particular pragmatic grace of working people who understood that what mattered was not the sentiment, but the action, and who had enough experience of the world to know that action was considerably rarer than sentiment. It was enough. Evelyn watched from the edge of the gathering and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for weeks. The legal proceedings against Charles Whitmore moved through the county court with the speed of a case where the evidence left no meaningful room for debate. Marcus Hale filed in billings. Foster Gill's lawyer contacted Hale's office within 48 hours of the Wyoming documents being formally submitted, and the negotiation that followed lasted less than 2 weeks. Foster Gill agreed to void both land transfers and pay restitution for the time the parcels had been held, plus surveying costs, plus a figure that Hale described to Will as appropriate encouragement not to try this again. Will told Evelyn the total when it was done. She raised an eyebrow. "He paid that willingly," she said. "His lawyer told him what a Montana jury would make of the full evidence package," Hale said dryly from across the office where he was packing his case. "Foster Gill is not a man who enjoys being in rooms where people are angry at him." Charles Whitmore did not settle. He hired a lawyer from Billings, who made several vigorous arguments about management authority and discretionary financial decisions, and every one of those arguments met Evelyn's documentation and stopped there, like water hitting a wall. The criminal proceedings took longer than the civil, nearly 4 months, but the outcome was not something anyone in that county courthouse ever seriously doubted. When the verdict came, Evelyn was in Billings for the proceedings. She sat in the back of the courtroom and watched Charles Whitmore hear a number of years read aloud in a formal voice, and watched his face go through several things in quick succession before settling into something she had seen once before. The flat, tired thing beneath the confidence, the thing that had always been there when the performance ran out. She didn't feel satisfaction exactly. She'd expected to. She had been carrying this for months, and she'd thought there would be something clean about the end of it. What she actually felt was tired, and then underneath the tired, something quieter, something that was about Thomas and the bank and the $14. Something about what it cost to tell the truth when you were the only one in the room who would, and nobody had yet given you permission. She had not needed the permission. That was the part she kept coming back to. She had not waited for it. She took the late wagon home to Red Willow Ranch. Will was at the creek when she got back. It was evening by then, the light coming down long and gold the way it did at this hour. She came through the cottonwoods, and he was there, boots off the way he always was. Hat on the ground beside him, and he looked up when he heard her, and the thing in his face when he saw her was so immediate and unguarded that she had to look away for a moment just to have somewhere to put it. "Verdict," he said. "Guilty," she said, "on all counts." He nodded. Not triumphant, just settled. She sat beside him. They were quiet for a while. The creek ran low and steady, the way it had on every evening she'd come here, the way it had been running since before either of them existed, and would run long after. There was something about that she found steadying. "I've been thinking," Will said. "About what?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment in the particular way he was quiet when he was choosing words with care. "About the fact that you came here 26 days into a job you'd taken because you had $14 and a borrowed suitcase," he said. "And in the time since then, you've rebuilt the accounts of this ranch, documented 5 years of fraud. recovered 63 acres of land, gotten 14 men their wages back, and helped put a man in front of a criminal court. He paused. And you've been paid an accountant's wages for all of it. She looked at him. I've been paid fairly, she said carefully. You've been paid for accounting, he said. Not for the rest of it. The rest of it wasn't in the contract, she said. No, he said. It wasn't. He turned toward her. I want to change the contract. She looked at him steadily. I want you to stay on, he said. Not as the accountant. Not just as the accountant. He held her eyes. I want you to be part of this ranch in the way that means you have a stake in it. A real stake, not wages, ownership. She hadn't expected that word, not that specific word. Will, I've talked to Hale, he said. I can structure it as a formal partnership, a percentage of the operation, your name on the deed. He paused. I'm not asking you to make a decision about anything else. I'm not asking you to be anything other than what you are. I'm saying this ranch is better with you in it in a way that has nothing to do with what I feel when I see you come through those trees. She sat with that for a moment. You're separating the two things, she said. I'm trying to, he said. Because I don't want you to say yes to one because of the other, or no to one because of the other. She turned and looked at the creek. She thought about what it meant to be offered something she had earned. Not given. Not granted as a favor. Offered because someone had looked at what she'd done and said, this is your value, and I intend to recognize it formally. She thought about the $14. She thought about the lawyer who had explained things slowly. She thought about 26 days of carrying the truth in a document case with a false bottom, working by lamplight after supper, walking fence lines in the early morning, sitting in an equipment shed with a bespectacled forger's statement in her hands. She thought about what Thomas would have said. Thomas, who had been gentle and honest, and who would have sat very still and thought carefully, and then said something like, Evelyn, you've earned this. Don't you dare say no to what you've earned. I want to see the partnership structure in writing before I agree to anything, she said. Will said nothing for a moment. Then, that's entirely reasonable. I'll have changes, she said. I'd be worried if you didn't, he said. She looked at him. And the other thing, she said. The thing that isn't the partnership. He looked back at her. I'm not a simple woman, she said. I need you to know that clearly. I have opinions and I keep my own records and I will tell you when I think you're wrong. I know that, he said. You say that now, she said. But knowing it and living with it are different things. Evelyn, he said. His voice was quiet and entirely certain. I spent 3 years living on my own ranch pretending to be a hired hand so I could find out if the people around me were telling me the truth. He held her eyes. I do not have a problem with a woman who says what she means. She looked at him. She thought about the first fence post. You'll need to dig that out about 2 feet deeper than it looks. I was figuring 3. 3 is better. She thought about all the evenings at the creek, the coffee that appeared without comment, the ring of keys left on the corner of her desk, the way he had said, I needed to know if you trusted the truth, not my name, and meant every word of it. She thought about what it felt like to stop being alone in a fight. All right, she said. He was still. All right to which part? He asked. She looked at him directly. Both, she said. The smile came again, that full, unguarded smile that she had seen for the first time the morning after the confrontation, and that she was beginning to understand was the truest thing about his face. He didn't try to contain it, and she was glad of that. He reached over and covered her hand with his, just once, just briefly, the touch of a man who understood that some things didn't need to be made large to be real. I'll have Hale draw up the partnership papers Monday, he said. I'll have my edits back to him by Wednesday, she said. Of course you will, he said, and the warmth in it made her feel something she had not felt in a very long time. Safe. Not the safe of a door locked against the world. The safe of being exactly where you were supposed to be with exactly the right person beside you. They sat at the creek a while longer. The evening came down fully, and the stars appeared one at a time, enormous and unhurried. The ranch was quiet around them. The men were in the bunkhouse. The horses were settled. The accounts were in order. All the accounts, every number, honest and documented and verified. The land was whole, all of it, every acre. The northern parcel, with its empty cabin that had been Will's father's first structure, returned cleanly to the registry where it had always belonged. "One thing I still want to know," Evelyn said. "Ask it," Will said. "Denton Cole," she said. "Did you write the letter?" "Wrote it the same day you told me to," he said. "Sent it 3 days later when Hale confirmed the Wyoming address." He paused. "I told him his name had been used without his knowledge. I told him what we'd found and what we'd done about it. And I told him if he ever wanted to come back to Red Willow Ranch, his job was here." She looked at him. "Did he write back?" "Not yet," Will said. "But Hale says the letter was received." He was quiet for a moment. "I hope he writes back. He was a good hand. Better than good. He noticed something was wrong when nobody else was paying attention, and Charles ended his livelihood for it." He paused. "That's a debt you can't fully repay, but you can try." Evelyn thought about that. About the long chain of it, one man who noticed something wrong, who got punished for noticing, whose punishment created the distance that allowed 5 years of fraud to continue until a woman with $14 and a borrowed suitcase arrived and started asking questions that nobody had thought to ask before, or that people had been afraid to ask, or that people had asked and paid for. The chain of it was long, and it had cost more people more than it should have. That was the truth of it, and she didn't look away from that truth any more than she looked away from any other. But the chain had ended. She had helped end it. She had not waited for permission. She had not waited for someone to tell her she was allowed. She had sat down at a desk covered in dishonest paper with a pen in her hand, and she had kept going. "Will," she said. He said. "The cabin on the northern parcel," she said. "Your father's. You said it's been empty." "For years," he said. "I've kept it maintained, but I haven't. I don't go out there much." She was quiet for a moment. "You should go," she said. "When you're ready. Not to do anything with it, just to go." He turned and looked at her. "Some things," she said quietly, "deserve to be stood in front of and acknowledged, even the things that hurt." He looked at her for a long moment. "Will you come with me?" he said. She looked at the creek. "Yes," she said, "when you're ready." He turned back to the water. He was quiet. But it was the quiet of a man who had just put something down, not the quiet of a man carrying it still. Months later, when the story of what had happened at Red Willow Ranch had traveled through the territory, the way stories traveled carried by wagon drivers and supply men and county officials, and workers who moved from ranch to ranch and took their conversations with them. People told it in different ways, depending on who was telling it. Some told it as the story of the owner who fooled everyone. The rich man who worked like a poor man until the right moment, and then revealed himself and brought the fraud down. Some told it as the story of the accountant, the widow with $14 who walked into a nest of corruption and documented her way through it without flinching. Some told it as a love story, which it was, though not the kind that could be contained in a simple telling. Holt told it when people asked him as the story of a ranch that got honest. "Wasn't complicated," he said in his way. "The place needed telling the truth and somebody told it. That's all." That was most of it. That was the heart of it, the thing underneath all the ledger books and forged contracts and creekside conversations and document cases with false bottoms. The place needed telling the truth, and Evelyn Harper had walked in with a borrowed suitcase and told it. Not because she'd been hired to, not because the wages were good or the circumstances were easy, or because anyone had told her she was allowed. She had done it because she was the kind of woman who could not look away from a wrong number, and because sometimes that particular stubbornness, the refusal to let a lie stand just because it was convenient, the insistence on cross-referencing everything 3 times, the willingness to bury your evidence 18 inches down in oilcloth at the base of a cottonwood tree, rather than let it be taken from you. Sometimes that stubborn, unglamorous grinding commitment to the truth was exactly what the moment required. Not courage in the dramatic sense, not a single grand gesture, just a woman who kept going, and a quiet man who had been waiting at the creek knowing she would. Red Willow Ranch stood on the Montana plain for decades after that season, and the people who worked it were paid what they were owed, and the accounts were kept honestly. And every record was documented in a clear hand and cross-referenced to 3 independent sources. Because that was how the woman who kept the books had always done it, and nobody who worked there ever suggested doing it any other way. Some things, once you've had them done right, you don't settle for less. That was what Red Willow Ranch became. Not the richest spread in Montana territory, not the largest, the most honest. And in a land where the difference between survival and ruin came down to whether the people around you told the truth that was worth more than all the rest. Evelyn Harper had known that since the day she sat beside her husband's grave and made herself a promise with no witnesses and no ceremony. She had kept it. Every single day she had kept it. And the quiet cowboy who had stood in the dust beside a rotted fence post on an August morning and recognized immediately, completely, and without a single doubt that the woman who'd just told him to dig 3 feet down was the person he'd been waiting for, that man had kept his promise too. To the ranch, to the workers, to the truth, and to her. Some people found what they were looking for by searching for it. Some people found it by being exactly who they were in exactly the right place, and letting that be enough. Evelyn Harper had been a widow with $14 a borrowed suitcase and a pen. She had been exactly enough. And at Red Willow Ranch in the summer of 1884, on a stretch of Montana ground that had been built by honest hands and nearly lost to dishonest ones that had turned out to be precisely everything,